In this chilling true crime story, we dive deep into the twisted revenge of Brittany Pilkington, a tale of guilt, madness, and a haunting that won't let go. Stay with us till the end, because what you're about to hear will leave you questioning the true cost of revenge and whether we can ever escape the consequences of our darkest actions. This is not just a crime story. It's a journey into the terrifying depths of the human soul. The house stood still. Quiet. Too quiet. The air felt thick with tension. Brittany Pilkington stared at the dark corners of the living room, her breath shallow. Her heart raced. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, there was only the sound of her thoughts. She could hear the creak of the floorboards beneath her, each step a reminder of what was to come. The house, once full of life, now felt like a tomb. The silence was broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Brittany's eyes flickered toward the stairs. She could almost hear them, her children, their laughter, their cries. But they weren't there anymore. They were gone, taken from her. She squeezed her eyes shut. The memories hit her like a wave. The laughter, the cries, the anger. She remembered the rage, the way it had boiled inside her, how it felt like a fire, consuming everything in its path. She had been pushed to the edge. The final straw came after that phone call. Her husband's words, like a slap to the face. "You're not good enough. Not good enough to be their mother." That was all it took. The switch flipped, and the twisted plan began to form. Brittany had already suffered enough. She was done. Done with the lies. Done with the pain. Done with the betrayal. Her hands trembled as she reached for the cold steel of the knife. She didn't want to hurt them. She never meant to hurt them. But they had to pay. They had to feel the same pain she felt. Each movement felt slow, deliberate. The air grew heavier with every second. The kitchen, once warm and inviting, now felt alien. The sound of the knife slicing through the air echoed like thunder. In the silence, it was deafening. Her heart pounded in her chest. Her pulse raced. She could feel the warmth of her breath on her skin, quick and shallow. The moment was coming. The door to the bedroom creaked open. Her hand tightened around the knife. Everything was still, except for the sound of her own heartbeat. The final act had begun, and there was no turning back now. Her footsteps were measured, deliberate. The knife felt heavier in her hand with each step. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch and twist as she moved. Her mind raced. The anger had settled into something darker now. Something final. She stopped in front of the bedroom door. For a moment her breath caught. Her heart, in her throat, seemed to stop. But she pushed the door open. It creaked like an old hinge, breaking the oppressive silence. Inside, the room was dim. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows on the walls. The children's beds were empty, but the weight of their absence felt suffocating. Brittany stood still in the doorway. Her eyes darted to the crib in the corner. Her breath was uneven. There it was, the twisted silence, the calm before the storm. Her hand gripped the knife tighter. The plan was set. She could feel the cold steel beneath her fingers, as if it were part of her. She took a step forward, then another, each step heavier than the last. Her pulse echoed in her ears, loud and unrelenting. She glanced back at the door, making sure no one would walk in. No one could stop her now. The sound of the wind outside had grown louder, almost like the world itself was trying to warn her. But she didn't listen. Her eyes moved back to the crib. And there it was again, the presence of something lost. Her breath quickened. Her legs shook. The twisted, broken thoughts swirled around her like a cyclone. A final, gut-wrenching decision had been made. She was beyond saving. The house was silent, but her thoughts screamed. The plan was already in motion. The act had already begun. And there was no going back. The room felt suffocating now, each breath a struggle. Brittany's eyes were fixed on the crib, yet her mind was somewhere else. A whirlwind of emotions, none of them good. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold wooden slats of the crib. Her gaze shifted to the empty beds, the quiet space where her children once slept. A sharp pang of grief shot through her chest, but it was fleeting. The rage still burned hotter. Her vision blurred for a moment. Then, in the corner of the room, something caught her eye. A soft, stuffed toy lay on the floor, abandoned, forgotten. Her fingers twitched, but she resisted the urge to bend down and pick it up. Instead, she turned back to the crib, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the knife's cold weight pulling her hand lower, guiding her movements. The shadow of what she was about to do loomed large in the room. Her chest heaved with each breath. Everything felt distant, like she was watching herself from outside her body. A sick feeling settled in her stomach. But there was no turning back now. Her grip on the knife tightened once more, her knuckles white against the handle. She knew what she had to do. It wasn't just a plan anymore. It was inevitable. The air felt thick, like a storm waiting to break. Then a sound, a faint creak, came from behind her. Her body stiffened, frozen for a split second. It was only a cat, creeping through the open window. But that sound, so small, so innocent, felt like a reminder of everything she had lost. And in that moment, a wave of doubt crashed over her. She turned her back to the crib, staring at the walls, trying to hold herself together. What had she become? But then she remembered his words again. "You're not good enough." The anger, the shame, it came rushing back. She gritted her teeth, eyes narrowing. She had been wronged. She would make them understand. The knife was in her hand, and nothing would stop her now. The weight of the knife felt different now, colder, heavier. Her grip was unyielding, as if the blade had fused with her hand. Brittany stepped forward once more, her movements slow but sure. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears, louder than the silence around her. Every inch of the room seemed to stretch, suffocating her with its stillness. Her eyes locked on the crib, the empty space where her children had once been. The space now seemed to mock her, to remind her of the emptiness she felt. A cruel reminder of her twisted sense of justice. She reached the crib, staring down at it for what felt like an eternity. Her mind flashed with images of what could have been. The laughter, the warmth, the hugs. But those were gone now. Taken. She had no choice but to take control. The anger surged again, hot and suffocating. The knife felt like an extension of her hand. It was a symbol of the pain she had endured. And she would make them feel it too. The plan was simple. The execution, a twisted art form. Brittany's breath quickened as she leaned over the crib. Her body hovered above it, the tension unbearable. She could almost hear the soft sound of their breathing, even though they weren't there. The air around her seemed to vibrate with an energy she couldn't escape. The edges of her vision darkened, narrowing to the point of no return. Her hand was shaking, but she didn't let go. The door behind her creaked again, but this time, she didn't flinch. There was no one left to stop her. Her fingers tightened further around the knife's hilt, the cold steel pressing against her palm. In the stillness of the room, time seemed to stand still. Her pulse was erratic, a drumbeat in her chest. And yet, the silence remained. Until it wasn't silence anymore. The softest of whispers echoed from the hallway. She froze, the air thick with anticipation. A voice. But who? Her eyes darted toward the door. And for a moment, she thought she saw a shadow moving in the dark. A figure. But it couldn't be. There was no one left. Not anymore. The shadow lingered in her peripheral vision. It wasn't real, she told herself. It couldn't be. But the sensation of being watched was undeniable. Her breath hitched, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she hesitated. The knife trembled in her hand, its cold edge digging into her palm. Her gaze flicked to the door, heart pounding. The shadow, was it real? Her feet were frozen to the floor, unwilling to move. A heavy silence filled the room once more. Then, the whisper came again. It wasn't a voice she recognized, but something haunting. A soft, raspy sound that sent chills down her spine. Brittany's head snapped back to the crib, eyes wide with panic. Her mind screamed for her to act, to do it. But there was something inside her that resisted. What if she was wrong? What if this wasn't what she wanted? The shadow moved again, more distinctly this time, as though it were growing closer. Brittany's stomach churned, a sick, twisting feeling crawling up her throat. She didn't want to look back at the door.
But she did.
And there, in the darkness, a figure stood. For a moment, her mind couldn't process what she was seeing. It was a figure, shrouded in shadow, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the blackness of the room. Brittany's hand shook violently, the knife slipping slightly in her grasp. She backed away slowly, the figure never moving, its presence more suffocating than the silence had been. Was it real? It had to be. She could feel its presence, heavy and watching. Her heart raced, the noise in her chest deafening. She backed further away, her feet stumbling. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, eyes locked on hers, its hollow gaze sending a wave of terror crashing over her. Brittany's breath came in ragged gasps now. The figure was too much to ignore. Her mind screamed at her to run,
To escape.
but her body wouldn't obey. Her hand still clutched the knife. Her pulse thudded in her ears. The darkness around the figure seemed to press in, as if the room itself were closing in on her. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared.
Gone.
Like a wisp of smoke in the air. Brittany blinked, unsure whether she had imagined it. The silence returned, but it was different now. More suffocating. More threatening. The shadows in the room had grown deeper. The knife felt heavier in her hand. The air in the room felt thick, like a weight pressing down on her chest. Brittany's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been a hallucination? Or had someone really been there? Her grip on the knife tightened, her knuckles white with tension. She felt the cold metal bite into her palm, a stark contrast to the heat building inside her. Her breath came in shallow gasps as her eyes darted around the room. The shadows were darker now, more oppressive. It was as though the house itself was closing in on her, suffocating her with its silence. Her heart hammered in her chest, the thudding so loud that it seemed to echo in the space. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the room. Something had changed. The figure, whether real or not, had left an imprint. But was it a warning? Brittany's fingers flexed around the knife, the steel cool and solid in her hand. The feeling of being watched lingered, crawling under her skin. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, each breath harder to take. She could still hear the whispering, faint but persistent, like a voice from the beyond. Her pulse quickened. She had come this far. She couldn't stop now. The anger surged again, stronger this time. The twisted sense of justice, of revenge, was too deep in her to let go. But as her eyes moved back to the crib, a wave of doubt washed over her. The rage that had consumed her moments ago seemed to waver, just for a second. Could she really go through with this? Her mind screamed in turmoil, the echoes of her children's laughter, their cries, all swirling together. But the shadow, the figure that had appeared, had it been a manifestation of her guilt? Her hesitation? The darkness inside her? She swallowed hard, but the knot in her throat wouldn't loosen. She knew she had to make a choice. The knife was still in her hand, the plan still lingering, a twisted thread that bound her. Her breath caught in her chest. Her gaze locked on the empty crib once more. There was no going back. Not now. She stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath her feet. The house, still and quiet, seemed to hold its breath. Each step felt like it echoed in the silence. Her heart pounded, and as she reached the crib, the darkness in the room seemed to close in tighter. The darkness pressed in, suffocating her every movement. Brittany's hand, still gripping the knife, trembled, but there was no turning back now. The air felt thick, sticky with the weight of the moment. Each breath was shallow, her chest tightening as she stared at the empty crib. The whispers, faint but unrelenting, seemed to fill the room, creeping into her mind. She could feel the eyes of the shadow on her again, though the figure had disappeared. But it was there, in the back of her mind, lingering like a specter. Her fingers tightened around the knife, knuckles white, the cold steel grounding her in this twisted reality. The silence was unbearable now. Every small sound, every creak of the floorboard, amplified in the oppressive quiet. Her eyes locked on the crib, and the image of her children, her lost children, flooded her mind. She had been so wronged,
So betrayed.
the rage surged again, an uncontrollable force, pushing her forward. The plan, her twisted, dark plan, had been set long ago. The knife was still in her hand, but now it felt like an extension of her own soul. Her mind was a whirlwind of chaos, torn between the anger, the pain, the need for justice, and the faintest trace of regret. But she was past the point of no return. Brittany leaned over the crib, her body trembling, her eyes hollow. The cold air seemed to bite at her skin, every breath a reminder of the irreversible decision she was about to make. In the stillness of the room, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Her eyes narrowed as her heart hammered in her chest. Her breath was ragged, uneven, as she raised the knife. And for a split second, everything stopped. The room was completely still. Her mind, too. In that moment, Brittany's gaze softened, just for a moment, as if she could see the faces of her children. And in that fleeting second, the weight of what she was about to do crashed down on her like a wave. But it was too late to stop now. The knife descended, and with it, the silence broke. A sharp sound filled the room, metal against flesh. Her own breath caught in her throat. The echo of the moment seemed to hang in the air, long after it had passed. The house, once full of life and warmth, now felt cold, empty. Brittany stood frozen, the knife still in her hand, as the room seemed to spin around her. The darkness had claimed her, and there was no escaping it now. The room spun. The walls seemed to close in around her. Brittany stood motionless, the knife heavy in her hand, its blade glistening in the dim light. Her breath was shallow, her pulse thudding in her ears like a drumbeat she couldn't escape. The silence had returned, but it was different now. It felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her with its emptiness. Her fingers twitched, but the knife didn't drop. She couldn't let go. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in, slowly, like quicksand pulling her under. She couldn't move. The room felt smaller, tighter, as though the walls were pressing in around her. Her eyes shifted to the crib, the empty space where her children had once been. But there was no comfort there, no solace. Nothing remained but the hollow echo of a twisted decision. The anger, the pain, had it really been worth it? The rage had seemed so clear in the moment, like a fire that burned through everything in its path. But now, the flame had gone out, and only ashes remained. Her chest tightened, a mix of fear, regret, and disbelief coursing through her. The whispers were back, louder this time, swirling around her, crawling under her skin. Her stomach churned, nausea rising as the weight of her actions crushed down on her. What had she done? Her eyes darted around the room, the shadows in the corners seeming to move, shift, as if they were alive. The air had grown cold, sharp, biting at her skin. It felt as though the house itself was closing in, the walls pressing tighter, squeezing the life out of her. But she couldn't move. She couldn't think. Only the coldness of the knife in her hand, the blood on her hands, and the silence that followed. The sound of her own heartbeat thudded in her ears, each beat more desperate than the last. Her legs wobbled, and she finally collapsed to her knees, the knife slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The room seemed to spin around her, her vision blurring, everything fading into a dull, overwhelming haze. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't escape the suffocating darkness that had claimed her soul. Her head dropped to her hands, and for the first time, Brittany Pilkington wept. Her sobs echoed in the empty room, mixing with the silence that now enveloped her. The house was cold, so cold, and there was no one left to hear her cries. Brittany's sobs were the only sound that filled the room, the only thing that seemed to anchor her to reality. Each breath was ragged, torn between grief and disbelief. The weight of her actions crushed down on her chest, an unbearable pressure that seemed to squeeze the air from her lungs. Her hands shook violently as they pressed against her face, wiping away the tears, but they wouldn't stop. The silence was deafening. But there was something else in the air now, a presence, heavy and suffocating. She didn't want to look up. She didn't want to face the darkness that had taken over her mind, her actions, her very soul. But something pulled her gaze toward the floor. The knife lay there, glinting in the dim light, its edge stained, still. A cold reminder of what she had just done. Her eyes traced its blade, her heart pounding faster with every beat. The reality of it all settled in deeper now, seeping into her bones. She had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. She had become what she never thought she could be, a monster. But as the tears blurred her vision, something else began to creep into her mind, an almost tangible sensation, a pull, a shift. She couldn't explain it, but the air had grown even colder. Her skin tingled with an unsettling chill, the feeling of being watched returning. Her head snapped up, eyes wide. The shadows in the room seemed to move, twisting in a way that didn't seem natural. She felt it again, the presence. But it wasn't just in her mind this time. The figure was there, once more. A shape in the dark corner of the room, its outline barely visible but unmistakable. Brittany's breath caught in her throat. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, as the figure seemed to draw closer. Her body went rigid. The figure remained motionless, but its eyes, the glowing eyes, pierced the darkness, fixated on her. The air around her grew even colder, like an invisible force closing in, suffocating her. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, but her body wouldn't obey. She was trapped. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, overlapping, chaotic, as the figure moved closer, its presence undeniable, overwhelming. Her body trembled, the fear consuming her as she fought to make sense of what was happening. It wasn't real, she told herself. It couldn't be. But the fear, the dread, it felt so tangible. It was real. The figure took a step forward, and she could almost feel its icy breath on her skin. Her heart pounded in her chest, her limbs heavy as if trapped in concrete. And just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, slipping back into the darkness. The silence returned. But it was different this time. It was thicker, heavier. And Brittany, her breath still shallow, could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on her, more suffocating than ever before. She was no longer alone. And the house that had once been full of life, felt like a prison. A place where she could never escape. The silence was suffocating now. It clung to her like a second skin, heavier than anything she'd ever felt. Brittany's breath was shallow, ragged, each inhale like a desperate plea for air that never came. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, to break the oppressive stillness. But there was nothing. The walls seemed to close in even. tighter, and her chest tightened with every passing second. She wanted to scream, to shatter the silence, but the words wouldn't come. Her fingers dug into the floor beneath her, the cold wooden boards pressing against her skin, grounding her to the reality of her actions. She couldn't escape. The darkness had swallowed her whole. It had taken root in her soul, twisted and corrupt. And now it was all-consuming. The figure was gone, but it had left something behind, something unshakable. A sense of impending doom. It clung to her, wrapping around her heart like a vice. She couldn't move. Her limbs felt frozen, trapped in place by the weight of guilt and fear. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of everything, but it only spiraled deeper into chaos. The house felt wrong now. The air felt wrong. Even the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, as if they were alive, watching her. Her eyes moved to the crib again. The empty crib. And that's when it hit her, the crushing weight of her loneliness. What had she done? The people she had once loved, her children, were gone. Gone because of her. She had destroyed everything. Her sobs grew louder now, a wretched sound, raw and painful. The guilt tore through her, a wave of agony that made her feel like she was being torn apart from the inside. But even as she wept, the feeling of being watched never left her. The presence was still there, lingering close. She could feel it in the very air. Brittany wiped her tears, her body trembling, her mind numb with horror and disbelief. She could hear it now. Whispers, faint but unmistakable, like voices that had come from the very walls. Her eyes widened in terror. There was no escaping it. She had done something terrible, something unforgivable, and the darkness would follow her forever. Her hands shook as she slowly lifted herself from the floor, her body weak and unsteady. The house felt like it was closing in on her, every step a struggle, the weight of her actions pulling her deeper into the abyss. Her gaze never left the shadows, and for the first time, she truly understood that she would never be free again. She was trapped. In this house. In her own mind. The darkness had claimed her, and there was no escape. The walls of the room seemed to pulse with the weight of her thoughts, each heartbeat echoing in the suffocating silence. Brittany's legs buckled beneath her as she stumbled, her knees hitting the cold floor, but she barely noticed. The pain was nothing compared to the crushing guilt that weighed down on her chest. The whispers, those soft, unsettling voices, had never stopped, but now they seemed louder, more insistent. They weren't coming from the walls or the shadows, or even her mind anymore. They were coming from everywhere, swirling around her, pressing in from all sides. She clutched her head, trying to block them out, but it was impossible. Their words were like poison, seeping into her soul, digging deeper and deeper with every passing second. You did this. You'll never escape it. Why did you do it? Look at what you've become. Brittany's hands trembled violently as she pressed her palms against her ears, desperate to block out the voices. But they only grew louder, more intense. The sound seemed to echo through the house, a deafening cacophony that reverberated in her bones. Her chest tightened with every breath, the air in the room now thick and suffocating. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer, reaching out toward her as if they had come alive, hungry and waiting. She looked around the room, but everything seemed wrong. The walls closed in, and the dim light from the broken lamp above flickered, casting erratic shadows that twisted and writhed like living creatures. Her mind was a blur of confusion, horror, and dread. She wanted to run, to escape the nightmare she had trapped herself in, but there was no escape. The house that had once been her home, had become a prison of her own making. The whispers began to fade, their words morphing into a low, guttural growl that rumbled in the depths of her mind. She couldn't breathe. Her chest felt like it was being crushed under a weight she couldn't see or understand. And then there was a sudden, sharp noise, A creak of the floorboard, a subtle disturbance in the air. Her body froze. From the corner of her eye, she saw it again. The shadow. The figure. Standing just outside the door, its glowing eyes staring directly at her. She couldn't move.
Couldn't breathe.
The figure took a slow step toward her, its form twisting and shifting as if made of smoke and shadows. Its eyes glowed brighter now, filling the room with an unnatural, eerie light. Brittany's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she stared at it, her body shaking uncontrollably. The figure took another step forward, and suddenly, she could feel its presence, like a weight on her skin. The air around her grew colder, as if the room had become a tomb. She opened her mouth to scream, to beg for mercy, but no sound came out. Her throat was dry, parched, as though she had lost the ability to speak. The figure moved closer, its eyes never leaving hers. Its shape flickered in and out of focus, as if it were both there and not there at the same time. Brittany could feel the darkness wrapping around her, tightening its grip with every passing second. She wanted to run, to escape, but she couldn't move. And in that moment, she realized with a sickening clarity that the darkness was never going to let her go. It was inside her now. It was a part of her. And no matter how hard she tried to escape, it would always follow her, always haunt her. There was no escape. Not anymore. The figure loomed over her, its glowing eyes piercing her soul, as the whispers once again filled the room, this time in a low, mournful chant. The house, once a home, was now her prison. Brittany's mind was a storm, a whirlwind of fear and regret, but she couldn't escape it. The figure loomed closer, its presence suffocating, its eyes fixed on her with a cold, unrelenting gaze. The whispers grew louder, sharper, like 1,000 voices all speaking at once, their words full of judgment, of condemnation. You can never be forgiven. You did this. No one can save you now. The air felt heavier, thick with the weight of everything she had done. The shadows stretched around her like long fingers, crawling toward her, curling around her body as though they were alive, binding her in place. She wanted to scream, to fight, but her body wouldn't obey. She could barely breathe, the cold air pressing against her chest like a physical force. Her fingers twitched, but they felt so far away, as if they didn't belong to her anymore. The knife, the one she had clutched so tightly before, was nowhere to be seen. It didn't matter. It wouldn't save her now. The figure reached out, its form flickering in and out of existence, like smoke in the dark. Its hands were long and thin, and as they moved closer to her, she could feel an ice-cold draft swirl around her, like death itself brushing past her skin. She shuddered, the temperature in the room plummeting further, the shadows swallowing the light until the room was pitch black. Brittany could still hear the whispers, even though the figure no longer spoke. It was as though the house itself was alive, full of voices, full of memories. Memories she wished she could forget. The sound was deafening, a constant barrage in her ears. She felt the presence behind her, the chill creeping down her spine, and she knew that it was closing in. There was nowhere to run, no one to save her. Her mind was fractured, the horror of what she had done reverberating through every inch of her being. But then, just as suddenly as the figure had appeared, it stopped. The room fell into a heavy silence. Brittany dared not move. She held her breath, her chest tight, as she waited for something, anything, to break the silence. But nothing came. The shadows that had once seemed alive now seemed still, almost like they were waiting, watching her, as if they were anticipating her next move. And in that silence, it dawned on her. This wasn't a haunting. This wasn't just a figment of her imagination. This was her consequence. She had summoned this darkness. The whispers, the figure, the cold, everything that had happened since she made her terrible choice. It was all a part of her. A reflection of the guilt, the anger, the twisted need for revenge that had consumed her. The room felt colder now, emptier, and yet somehow more suffocating. She didn't know how long she had been kneeling there, frozen, trapped in her own mind. Time felt irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the overwhelming sensation that she could never escape. The house had changed, but so had she. She was no longer the same woman who had walked through that door. The darkness had seeped into her soul, and it would never leave. Brittany took a tentative step forward, her legs weak, her body trembling. She looked around the room again. Everything was just as it had been. The crib, the shadows, the silence. But now it felt different. It felt final. There was no redemption, no salvation, only the endless void of regret. Her heart was heavy in her chest, but there was a strange numbness to it now. The weight of her actions had settled in, and it was too much to bear. But it didn't matter anymore. She couldn't undo it. She had crossed a line, and now the darkness would follow her for the rest of her life. No matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, this was her new reality. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't just suffocating, it was infinite. And Brittany, forever trapped in the cold, dark house of her own making, knew there would be no end to the torment. The house was still, the silence so thick it felt suffocating, as if the very air had turned to stone. Brittany's mind was numb, every thought fractured, shattered by the weight of what had transpired. She could feel the presence still lingering in the room, the darkness creeping in from every corner, suffocating her, closing in. Her legs were unsteady as she slowly rose to her feet. Her body felt like a hollow shell, and yet there was no escape. The walls felt as if they were pressing in on her. The shadows seemed to stretch further, tighter, as though they were alive, watching her every move. The whispers, though faint, still echoed in her mind, a reminder that she could never undo what she had done. She looked around the room, her once beloved home, now a prison. The walls were coated in the same cold, damp air that seemed to cling to her skin, to her soul. The crib was still empty, a cruel reminder of the life she had taken. Her children, the ones she had once sworn to protect, were gone. She reached out to touch the cold wall, her fingers grazing its surface as if trying to find something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing, only emptiness. The darkness had consumed everything, and there was no light left to guide her. The floor beneath her felt unstable, as if the very foundation of the house was crumbling under the weight of her guilt. She stumbled, her knees giving way, and collapsed to the floor with a soft thud. Her hands, still trembling, pressed against her face, as if trying to shield herself from the horror that was now her reality. She had wanted revenge, wanted to right the wrongs she had felt in her heart. But now it was clear there was no redemption, no way to fix what had been broken. The darkness wasn't just around her. It was inside her, woven into the fabric of her being. The figure from the shadows returned, its presence undeniable, its eyes cold and knowing. Brittany knew it wasn't a ghost, a mere figment of her imagination. It was her consequence. The figure was a reflection of everything she had done, everything she had become. Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel its icy gaze, the suffocating weight of its stare, and for the first time, she realized it wasn't just her house that had been haunted. It was her soul, and there was no escaping it. No redemption, no salvation. The darkness had won. It always would. The house was still, its silence profound, wrapping around Brittany like a suffocating shroud. She could feel the weight of the years that had passed, the time slipping away in the suffocating quiet. But the haunting truth was that time no longer mattered. What she had done, the darkness she had unleashed, would follow her forever. She couldn't move. She could barely breathe. The weight of her guilt pressed on her chest, suffocating her in its intensity. The figure in the shadows, though now still, was always there in the corner of her mind, a ghost of the terrible decision she had made. For a moment, she thought about the life she once had, the smiles, the laughter of her children, the promise of a future that had been so bright. But that was before the rage, before the twisted sense of justice had taken hold of her, before her own broken soul had consumed her, leaving only darkness behind. Now, she was alone, isolated in this house of nightmares she had built for herself. She finally rose to her feet, her legs shaky and weak beneath her, but she had to move. She couldn't stay in this place any longer. She couldn't keep living in this perpetual prison of her own making. But the house, the darkness, it was with her in every step. The shadows seemed to grow as she walked, bending and twisting around her, pressing her forward, guiding her down a path she couldn't escape. She thought of the house, of the life it had once held. It had been a home, full of laughter and warmth, once. And now? Now it was nothing more than a tomb, a reflection of everything lost. With each step, Brittany's heart ached. But the pain no longer consumed her as it once did. It had become a quiet ache, a constant reminder that she could never go back, that she would never be free from the consequences of her actions. As she reached the door, Brittany stopped. She placed her hand on the cold knob, feeling its texture, knowing what lay beyond. The world outside was waiting. But what was she returning to? Could she even find redemption there?
No.
There would be no redemption. She let go of the door handle. The darkness had won. And as the house swallowed her whole once again, Brittany Pilkington realized that the true terror was not in the shadows. It was in the reflection of her own soul.